In the autumn of 1889, in the failing town of Creston, Colorado, a creditor's auction drew 12 men and one woman to the yard of the Henshaw Coal Depot. The men came to buy. The woman came with $8 folded inside her left boot and a rolled set of blueprints under her arm, and most of the men assumed she had wandered in by mistake. The depot had been condemned since the Henshaw Coal Company dissolved the previous winter. Its owner dead, its assets stripped, its equipment hauled to Pueblo on 3 flat cars. What remained was a stone processing shed, a ruined sorting floor, and a long iron coal chute running down the north face of the shed to where the rail spur had once sat. The spur itself was gone. The chute hung at an angle over empty gravel, its iron housing pocked with rust the color of dried blood. Its lower housing swung partially away from its moorings by a winter storm nobody had bothered to repair. The auctioneer described the property in 10 words: coal processing structure on 140 feet of territorial lot. The woman's name was Maren Voss. She was 27 years old, and she had traveled from Denver with a mule, a tool satchel, and the blueprint copies she had requested from the Territorial Surveying Office 3 weeks before making the trip. She had studied those blueprints for 6 days before she came. When the bidding began, one of the men offered $2 as a joke. Another raised it to 3. Maren waited until the room had found what it thought was its ceiling, then said $8 without raising her voice. There was laughter, the kind that is not quite comfortable with itself. The auctioneer, a man named Tillis who had conducted sales of mules and bankrupt dry goods stores and the remains of a church organ, knocked the gavel and looked faintly sorry for her. The foreman who had run the depot during its last operating years, a broad and unhurried man named Hicks, leaned against the shed wall and told the man beside him that the woman had just purchased herself a very large piece of rust. What none of them knew, and what Maren Voss had come specifically to confirm, was that the coal chute in the Henshaw Depot yard did not point where the blueprints said it pointed. If you have ever wondered what it looks like when someone sees a lie drawn in pencil on paper and then walks out to measure the ground and find the thing the pencil left out, watch a minute more. What Maren found in that yard, and what it cost her to open it, is worth the time. Her father, Otto Voss, had been a mine surveyor in the Colorado Territories for 19 years before a collapsed timbering support on the eastern slope of the San Juan Range ended his life in the winter of 1885. He was a precise, unhurried man who believed that the single most dangerous thing in the world of underground structures was the gap between the drawing and the stone. The place where a builder had quietly done something other than what the engineer had specified, usually for reasons that made sense at the time and became lethal when the structure aged. He had spent the last 4 years of his life teaching his daughter to see that gap, not just to read drawings, but to read the relation of drawing to ground, to walk a site and feel with her feet where the two diverged. He taught her to pace foundation offsets, to use a plumb bob and a carpenter's angle to cross-check wall orientations, to read the coursing pattern of laid stone versus native rock. The tools she carried in the brown leather satchel at her hip were his: a steel-bodied compass, a 12-inch folding rule, a plumb bob on 20 feet of cord, a marking awl. He had not left her money. He had left her the knowledge that drawings lie by omission, and that the omissions are almost always where something was hidden. She had been working as a draftsman's assistant in Denver for 2 years after his death, copying survey maps for a land office on Blake Street. It was not the work she had trained for, but it was work she could do well and that no one questioned. A young woman with a steady hand and a good eye for the lines, and the pay kept her in a rented room above a milliner's shop on the East End, and fed her and fed Clem at the livery 2 streets over. She copied the maps that came across her desk without comment. Lot boundaries, water rights surveys, mining claims, railroad easements. She was faster than the man who had held the position before her and more accurate, and the land office manager, a round-shouldered man named Pryor, had told her so once in passing, and then appeared to forget she existed. She had not forgotten how to look. That was the thing her father had given her that 2 years of careful anonymity had not diminished. She looked at every drawing that came through her hands the way he had taught her to look, attending not just to what was on the paper but to the logic of what was on the paper, to whether the angles and the distances and the bearing notations added up to a real place that could exist in the physical world. Most of the time they did. Sometimes a survey was sloppily drawn, a wall notation off by a degree or two, a boundary line that did not close properly, and she would note it in the margin and pass it back. And Pryor would take it from her with the mild irritation of someone who would have preferred not to know. It was there that she first saw the Henshaw blueprint, not the original, which had been filed with the Territorial Surveying Office and was technically a public record, but a copy requested by the Land Office for an adjacent property survey in the late summer of 1889. The adjacent survey concerned a parcel abutting the Henshaw Depot to the east, and the Henshaw drawing had come along as a reference document, stapled behind the property deed in the usual way, and it had landed on her desk on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, with a dozen other papers she was expected to process by the end of the week. She had almost set it aside. The Henshaw Coal Company was already dissolved by then, the depot condemned, the company's debts in territorial receivership. The drawing was reference material only, needed to confirm the east wall boundary of the adjacent parcel. She unrolled it and set her weights at the corners and looked at it. The north wall baseline, the processing shed footprint, the rail spur marked with dotted lines already removed by the time the condemnation drawing was made, and the coal chute shown as a solid line running from the north face of the shed down to the spur terminus, with a bearing notation in the lower right corner of the chute run. She drew the bearing angle from the north wall in her head. Then she checked it against the compass rose on the drawing. It led to the spur. That was what it showed on paper. She set her pencil down. Her father had taught her, among the first lessons he ever gave her, that a chute is a structure with two purposes and one logic. It moves material from a high point to a low point, and it terminates at whatever the material is being moved into. A coal chute terminates at the receiving vessel, the car, the bin, the loading dock. You build the chute first and then the receiving end, or you build them simultaneously, because the angle and the terminus are the same decision. A chute that does not point at a receiving vessel is not a chute. It is a tube pointed at the ground. The Henshaw chute pointed at the spur. She looked at the bearing notation again. She looked at the north wall. She took out a piece of drafting paper and drew the wall, then drew the chute bearing from the wall in the correct proportion. The line ended at the spur. She looked at the bearing. She looked at the north wall one more time, and then, with the particular feeling she had learned to trust, the quiet, settled certainty that something wasn't where it was supposed to be, she walked out to the alley behind the land office building and paced the bearing in the dirt. She came back inside and requested the original filing from the territorial office that afternoon. Same angle, same bearing. The men who drew it had been consistent with each other at least. She requested a photographic survey of the site from a county assessor's record made during the condemnation inspection the previous spring. The photograph showed the depot yard from the south. The chute was visible, its iron housing clear against the cliff face to the north. She measured the angle of the chute housing in the photograph against the angle of the cliff. Then she measured the angle shown on the blueprint against the same cliff. They did not match. The chute in the photograph angled further north than the blueprint showed, away from the spur, toward the base of the cliff itself. She put the photograph down and sat for a moment in the late afternoon, the land office quiet around her, the sound of Blake Street coming through the single window at her left. Her father had said it plainly. The stone does not move. The drawing said the chute pointed one way. The photograph said it pointed another. One of them was wrong, or one of them was lying, and stone does not lie. The only way to know was to go and stand in the yard and measure the ground herself. She had made her travel arrangements within the week. The morning after the auction, Maren walked the depot yard in the early cold with the blueprints unrolled and weighted at the corners by stones. She paced the north wall baseline 3 times and recorded her measurements in a small notebook. Then she stood at the upper housing of the chute, where it mounted to the processing shed wall, and sighted down its length with the compass. The bearing was 22 degrees north of what the blueprint showed, not 15 as the photograph had suggested. 22. Either the photographs had been taken at an angle, or someone had adjusted the lower housing after the condemnation photograph was made. She looked at the lower housing, the section that had swung away from its moorings in the winter storm. It had not swung in the wind. It had been unbolted. The bolt holes in the iron flange were clean, and the bolts themselves were missing, not corroded in place. Someone had removed them deliberately, sometime in the past 2 years, and left the lower section hanging free. The chute pointed at the base of the cliff. The lower housing had been unbolted, possibly to suggest storm damage, possibly to discourage anyone from looking too carefully at what the chute was aimed at. She stood very still for a moment in the cold yard, the compass in her hand, the breath coming out of her in a thin white stream. Her father had told her once that the most useful thing about a lie drawn on paper was that it stayed where you put it. The stone, he said, does not move. The stone remembers what was built against it. She went to find rope. The work of dismantling the lower chute housing took the better part of 3 days. The iron brackets that held the lower section to the processing shed wall were not bolted, but lag screwed into the stone, 8 screws in the main bracket and 4 in the secondary brace, 1-inch iron lags driven into lead plugs set in the limestone. The screws had rusted into their plugs despite the removed flange bolts, which meant she could not simply lower the housing on a rope and swing it clear. Each screw had to be worked out individually, and a rusted lag screw does not come willingly. She soaked each one the night before with oil drawn from the small tin she carried in the satchel, and she left the oil to sit overnight in the cold yard, and in the morning she went at them with a wrench and a pry bar in alternation, using the pry bar to break the initial resistance and the wrench to walk the screw out a half turn at a time. The first day she freed 2 screws from the main bracket and got the secondary brace loose enough to bend slightly away from the wall. The chute did not move. It was a substantial piece of iron, the lower housing, perhaps 8 feet long and weighing more than she could have lifted, and it sat in its mounting with the settled obstinacy of something that had not been asked to move in 20 years. On the first day, the former depot foreman Hicks walked through the yard on his way to somewhere else and stopped. He watched her for a moment with her wrench at the bracket housing, her shawl pulled up around her shoulders against the October cold, the satchel open on the gravel beside her with its tools laid out in the order she always laid them, the way her father had taught her. "That chute's bolted to the cliff, same as God made it," he said. "She won't move." "The lag screws are rusted," Maren said without looking at him, "but they'll break loose." He stood for another moment. "What do you figure to find behind a coal chute?" "The cliff face," she said. He left, and she heard him say something to someone on the far side of the shed wall. And then there was only the wind across the yard and the sound of her wrench. The second day she freed 3 more screws and got the housing to shift slightly in its mounting. the iron groaning in a way that suggested it was losing the argument. She was working the seventh screw when the pry bar slipped on the bracket face and came down on her left palm, and she set the pry bar down and looked at her hand for a moment and wrapped it in a strip cut from the hem of her underskirt and went back to the screw. The cold helped, or seemed to. She did not think about the hand. She thought about the angle of the chute and where it was pointed and what her father had told her about the stone not moving. And she put the wrench back on the screw and worked it. Clem, tied to the ring in the shed wall, watched all of this with the patient skepticism of an animal that has weathered worse company in worse weather. He had carried her from Denver with the tool satchel across his back and the deed rolled in an oilcloth tube tied to the saddlebag, and he had stood in the yard for 2 days now, watching her do what she did. And his opinion, insofar as a mule's opinion can be read from the angle of his ears, was that she was probably right about whatever it was, and he was prepared to wait. On the third morning, she freed the last screw and rigged a rope from the housing top to a post she had sunk into the gravel 20 feet back to control the fall when the bracket let go. She took up the slack on the rope, tied it off, and struck the bracket with the sledge once, hard, in the center of its back face. The lower housing swung free with a sound like a bell being struck at the bottom of a well, a deep iron ring that carried across the empty yard and came back off the cliff face. She held the rope taut and walked the housing down until it rested on the gravel, the iron dust raining off it in a slow brown cloud. She stood with the rope still in her wrapped hand and looked at the cliff face where the housing had been. On the third day, with the lower housing finally clear of the wall and lying in pieces on the gravel, she stood facing the cliff at the chute's terminus for the first time, unobstructed. The stone was dark, streaked with the black residue of decades of passing coal, and at first it looked exactly as she had expected it to look. The raw limestone face of the outcrop, more or less uniform, meeting the gravel at its base. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went for her plumb bob. The coursing was wrong. Her father had taught her the difference between native limestone and coarse limestone in the 3rd year of her apprenticeship. In a played-out claim on the western slope above Ouray, he had tapped his knuckle against a wall at the back of a prospecting tunnel and asked her what she heard. She said it sounded like stone. He said to look at the joints. The joints in native limestone, he explained, are irregular, formed by the fracturing of the parent material over centuries, angling in different directions, sometimes nearly invisible. The joints in coursed limestone, the stone a mason lays, run in horizontal lines with the same rough spacing, because the cutter takes blocks from the same vein and works them to a similar thickness. You can color match coursed stone to its native surroundings so closely that a man glancing at a wall will see cliff face. A man who sets his plumb bob and follows the joint lines will see a wall. Marin followed the joint lines. The wall behind the coal chute's terminus was approximately 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall, faced with limestone pulled from the same cliff and dressed to approximate its parent surface. At the left edge of the wall, she found a narrow iron jamb, painted with the same gray wash as the surrounding stone. The jamb seated a pivoting iron door, hinged to swing inward. She stood in the cold for a full minute, her hand on the iron jamb, and did not push. There are things, she thought, that stay sealed for very good reasons, and there are things that stay sealed because someone needed them to. She pushed. The room behind the door was roughly 12 feet wide and 14 feet deep, cut directly into the cliff face. The ceiling was native limestone, low enough that she had to duck slightly at the entrance, rising to perhaps 6 feet at the center. The floor was packed earth, dry, and along the 3 interior walls stood wooden crates with iron corner bands, 16 of them by her count, stacked 2 high. The air that came out of the room when the door swung was dense and cold, the smell of stone and dry wood, and something faintly mineral. There was no coal dust in the room. Whatever had been moved along the chute had never come in here. She struck a match and held it up. The crates bore a label in black paint, 3 letters and a full name. H.C.C. Henshaw Coal Company. Below each company mark, a date range. The earliest she could read was 1877. The latest, 1887. She brought her lantern from the shed and spent the rest of the afternoon opening crates. She did not rush. She set the lantern in the center of the room on the dirt floor, where its light reached all 3 walls, and she went to the nearest crate and worked the lid with the pry bar, 1 nail at a time, the wood dry and tight from years of sitting undisturbed. The lid came off and she looked inside. The books were ledger volumes, cloth-bound in dark green fabric, each one approximately 14 inches by 9, with a stamped label on the spine indicating the company name, the year, and the quarter. She lifted the first one out carefully. It was heavier than she expected, dense with entries, the pages close pressed, the cloth binding worn slightly at the corners but otherwise intact. The sealed room had kept the damp out. Whatever Perdue had understood about the cliff's climate, he'd been right. She opened to the first page. 2 sets of columns ruled in black ink on cream paper, in 2 different hands. The left-hand columns were in a careful, small script that pressed very lightly on the page, the letters thin and consistent, the kind of hand that belongs to someone who writes a great deal and has learned to do it without fatigue. It recorded tonnage weights from the 3 adjacent extraction claims, the Reyes claim, the Birch claim, and the Dolan claim. Date of delivery, team size, number of loads, measured weight per load, total weight per delivery. The figures were specific and internally consistent in the way that genuine measurements are, varying by small amounts from load to load in the pattern of a real physical process, rather than a round number assumption. These were the actual weights. The right-hand columns were in a different hand entirely, looser and larger, the nib pressed harder into the page. They recorded the weights that had been filed with the contracted families for the purpose of calculating payment. The numbers were the same dates, the same delivery records, the same format. The numbers were not the same numbers. She looked at the first quarter's figures for the Reyes claim. The left column recorded 41 tons across 3 deliveries in January of 1877. The right column recorded 16 tons. She moved her finger down the page. February showed 38 tons in the left column, 15 in the right. March showed 44 in the left, 17 in the right. She turned to the last page of the volume and looked at the quarterly total. Left column total, 123 tons delivered. Right column total, 48 tons billed. 48 was approximately 40% of 123. She set that volume back in the crate and opened another, a later year. Same format, same 2 hands, same ratio. She opened another, the same. She worked through a third of the crates before she understood that she did not need to go further, that the pattern was not going to vary, that whoever had maintained these records had maintained them with the same undeviating discipline from the first quarter of 1877 to the last quarter of 1887. 48 quarterly volumes, 3 families, 12 years. Not a rounding difference, not a clerical error in 1 bad season. 40%, held as steady as a surveyor's plumb line across a decade of deliberate underpayment. She sat down on the floor of the cut room with the lantern beside her and thought about that for a while. 3 families. They had brought their coal down from the adjacent claims and delivered it at the Henshaw way station and been told what the scale said, and the scale had been wrong, or the scale had been right, and the figure written down had been wrong, and the families had been paid for less than half of what they had hauled. For 12 years. They had gone home at the end of each quarter and looked at the payment and perhaps felt vaguely that something did not quite add up, that the loads had seemed heavier than the receipt suggested, that the mules were working harder than the money implied, and they had had no way to prove it, because the only record that existed, the record filed with the territorial office and the one the families received, showed the same figures, the ones in the right-hand column. She did not need to calculate the total shortfall. The ledger compiler had already done that. On the inside back cover of the final quarterly volume in the same small left-hand script was a summary page. It listed each family each year, the difference between actual and paid tonnage, and the resulting underpayment at the contracted rate. Below the 3-column summary was a total figure. Below the total, a name, Purdue. Below the name, a date in the spring of 1887, 6 months before Amos Henshaw died of fever in his house on the ridge above Creston. She held the volume in her hands and looked at that page for a long time. Purdue had known. He had sat somewhere with the real weight records in one hand and the official records in the other, and had done the arithmetic, and he had compiled it all here in this room, in 48 quarterly volumes that told the complete story of what Amos Henshaw had been doing since 1877. Whether Purdue had built this record to protect himself from Henshaw, as leverage in case Henshaw decided to dispose of an inconvenient accountant, or whether he had done it because he could not bring himself to destroy the evidence of 12 years of theft, or whether some part of him had wanted it to be found after both of them were gone, she did not know. She would never know. Purdue had left the territory sometime in the fall of 1887, and no one in Creston seemed to know where he had gone. He had taken whatever his reasons were with him. The books were here. They were complete. They had 2 sets of figures side by side in the same volumes for every quarter of 12 years, and the 2 sets did not match. She sat on the floor of the cut room with the final ledger open on her knees and the lantern burning beside her. And she stayed there for a long time without moving. She thought about what her father would have said. She thought he would have said nothing and set his plumb bob back in the satchel and picked up the ledger. She picked up the ledger. If you have ever watched a wrong go right with no announcement and no fanfare, nothing like what the stories would suggest. Just a woman carrying a book across a gravel yard toward a mule. Then you already understand what happened next. Marin spent the following morning resealing the room, not to hide it again, but to protect the contents from the weather while she made arrangements. She took the final ledger and the first quarterly volume of 1877 as her witness copies and left the rest where they were. She tied both books in oilcloth from her satchel, secured them in Clem's saddlebag, and rode into Creston. Petra Reyes kept a dry goods store on the south end of Creston's main street, a narrow building with a glass window that needed washing and a sign painted in plain letters, her name and the word General below it, low. The store smelled of dried beans and lamp oil and the particular dusty sweetness of bolted cloth. She was a woman in her mid-60s with gray-streaked dark hair worn back from her face, and she had the particular kind of wariness that comes from watching institutions go through the motions of acknowledging you without ever quite arriving at anything that changes. She had run the store since her husband died in 1883, and before that she had stood beside the counter and helped him run it, and before that she had stood in the Reyes claim yard, and watched her father and her older brothers load the coal wagons for delivery to the Henshaw depot. She knew every person in Creston by name, and most of them by what they owed and when they had last paid it. Her father, Ramiro Reyes, had worked the family's extraction claim from 1874 until the Henshaw contract lapsed in 1887, and the payment rate had dropped low enough that running the claim no longer made sense. He was a careful man, her father, a man who kept his own records the way careful men do. A tally of loads delivered and weights received marked in a small book he kept in his coat pocket. She still had the book. It was in a drawer behind the counter because she had never quite been able to put it somewhere she could not reach it. Her father had died in 1892, still turning over in his mind the arithmetic that had never quite worked out, the loads that seemed heavier than the receipts acknowledged, the quarters where the payment did not seem to track the work. He had thought, in the end, that he had been sloppy somewhere, that he had miscounted something. Marin came into the store on the morning 3 days after opening the room and set the 2 oilcloth-wrapped ledgers on the counter beside the scale Petra used for flour and dried corn. She introduced herself simply, her name, and the fact that she had bought the depot at auction. "I know," Petra said. "Hicks told half the town." She looked at the oilcloth packages without touching them. "He said you spent 3 days pulling a coal chute off a wall." "I did," Marin said. He seemed to find that amusing. "He may continue to," Marin said. "I need you to look at something." She unwrapped the nearer package and opened the first quarterly volume of 1877 to the page she had marked, the January records for the Reyes claim, and set it on the counter with her finger on the left-hand column. Petra looked at it. She looked at the left-hand column and the right-hand column and the column headers and the dates. She looked at the numbers. She did not speak for 2 minutes. When she looked up, her expression had not changed in any dramatic way. It had simply become very still, the way a person goes still when they are doing a calculation they did not expect to need to do. "How many volumes are there?" she said. 16 crates, Marin said. 48 quarterly volumes. 3 families. Petra looked back at the page. She put her hand flat on it, covering the right-hand column with her palm, and kept it there. "There is a room behind the coal chute that was not on the blueprints," Marin said. "I need you to come and see it." She came that afternoon, and Marin took her through the yard and opened the iron door in the cliff face and held the lantern so that its light fell inside. Petra stood in the doorway and looked at the stacked crates without speaking. The crates were as Marin had found them, reorganized slightly where she had opened and resealed them, but the room was full and the dates on the crate labels were legible from the doorway. Petra stepped inside. She went to the nearest crate and put her hand on its lid, reading the date label. Then she went to the next one, and the next. She walked the 3 walls of the room slowly, reading each label in turn. She pulled a volume from near the back, a middle-year record, 1881, and opened it to the Reyes claim pages and stood reading in the lantern light. She did not sit down. She read for a long time. Marin waited outside on the gravel. The afternoon was cold and the yard was quiet, and she leaned against the shed wall and watched the light from the open door. Lay a pale rectangle on the gravel at the entrance. Inside she could hear the occasional soft sound of pages turning. When Petra came out, she set the 1881 volume in Marin's hands and was quiet for a moment. "My father kept a tally book," she said finally. "Every load, every weight they told him. He kept it because he thought he must be wrong somewhere, and he wanted to find where. He thought he'd miscounted the loads." "He hadn't miscounted," Marin said. Petra looked at the open door of the room for a moment. Then she looked at Marin. "No," she said. "He had not." They stood in the yard together in the late afternoon light, the two of them, the depot sheet casting its long shadow east across the gravel. Inside the open room behind them, the crates sat where they had sat for 2 years since Henshaw's death, the ledgers dry and complete, and patient as stone, 48 quarterly volumes that had been waiting in the dark for someone to follow the angle of the chute to where it actually led. The following week, Marin and Petra carried the witness volumes to the office of the territorial clerk in the county seat, a man named Alvord, who handled property disputes and unclaimed estate matters with the measured discomfort of someone who prefers his complications to arrive in small, manageable sizes. Marin set the ledgers on his desk. She set the blueprint copy beside them with the discrepancy she had documented marked in ink, and her site measurements recorded in the notebook beside it. She did not make a speech. She explained what the room was, where she had found it, and what the 2 columns of figures in each volume meant. Alvord read for 15 minutes without speaking. Then he sent for the estate trust officer. Garfield, the trust officer who had been managing the Henshaw estate's remaining assets, arrived that afternoon. He was a thin man in a good coat, and he sat across the desk from Alvord and read the same pages Alvord had read, and said nothing for a long time. He had not known the room existed. That was apparent from his face, which was not the face of a man concealing something, but the face of a man discovering that the thing he had been managing had a door in it that no one had given him a key to. The territory, he said at last, would need to appoint a records assessor. The estate trust would need to be reviewed. He looked at the ledgers as if they were something he would have preferred to encounter in someone else's afternoon. Marin said she understood, and that she expected the process to take whatever time it required. The estate review took 4 months. The records assessor appointed by the territorial court spent 6 weeks in the Henshaw depot room, working through each of the 48 quarterly volumes and preparing a comparative statement of actual versus paid tonnage figures for each of the 3 contracted families. The back payment calculation went to an appointed arbitrator. The Reyes family filed first, then the Birch descendants through a nephew in Pueblo, then the Dolan family through a surviving daughter in Denver. Garfield's authority over the depot property dissolved when the structure was formally designated a site of material evidence. The territorial court issued a restraining order on any further asset liquidation. None of this required Marin to raise her voice. None of it required a confrontation or a public reckoning. The ledgers did what ledgers do when they contain the truth. They sat quietly in front of people who could read them, and they waited. There was a morning in late winter after the assessor had completed his work and the volumes had been removed to the territorial records office in their original crates, when Marin walked through the depot yard in the early light and found it emptied of everything that had been hidden in it. The processing shed was still ruined. The iron chute housing she had dismantled still lay in sections on the gravel where she had left it. The cliff face was open, the room's iron door standing ajar as the assessor's team had left it, and the early light came through the door and lay in a pale rectangle on the floor of cut stone. She stood at the door and looked in. The room was empty now, and the smell of sealed air was gone, replaced by the cold, open smell of the cliff and the morning. It was a small room. It was an ordinary room, 12 feet by 14, with a low stone ceiling and a dirt floor and iron jamb that squeaked slightly when the door moved. It was the kind of space a builder makes when he needs somewhere to put something he cannot put anywhere else. Clem stood tied to the shed wall behind her, his ears turned slightly toward the open door, with the mild curiosity he brought to all things he did not understand. She put her hand on the iron jamb and felt the cold of it. Her father had told her in one of the last winters she had worked beside him that the thing about gaps between the drawing and the ground was that they were almost never accidents. Builders are not careless. When the stone goes somewhere the pencil did not, someone decided. The gap is a decision. What she had learned and what the work had always come back to was that a decision made in stone could be unmade the same way, by measuring the ground and following where it led, by taking the question seriously when the angles did not agree. She had followed the angle. She had done the work her father had taught her. The room was open and empty now, and whatever had sat in it for 2 years waiting to be found had found its way to where it needed to go. The chute itself would come down in spring. There was no rail spur to serve anymore, and the iron was more salvage value than structure. But for now it hung at its true angle above the open door of the room it had been built to conceal. And in the early light it looked almost like an arrow, rusted and patient, pointing at the one place on the blueprint that had always been blank. Some things are hidden because they are valuable. Some are hidden because they are dangerous, and some are hidden because whoever put them there could not think of another way to make sure they would survive long enough to be found by someone willing to follow the angle until it led somewhere the drawings had never shown. Marin picked up her satchel from the gravel, the weight of her father's compass and plumb bob familiar in her hand, and went to untie Clem from the shed wall. He regarded her with the long patience of an animal who has stood in many yards waiting for the person at the other end of the rope to finish her business with whatever it was that needed opening. She untied him. They stood together in the yard for a moment in the winter light, the two of them, and the open door and the cliff face behind them, and the quiet of the depot settling back around the space where 12 years of withheld debts had spent their 2 last winters waiting. If there is a room somewhere in your own experience that the blueprints left out, leave a word below. It has been the particular work of this channel to find those rooms and follow what is inside them. There is another story here of a woman and a thing the world dismissed, and it is waiting if you want it. This story is a work of historical dramatization. The territory of Colorado, its surveying records, coal contracting practices, and estate procedures of the 1880s are drawn from period documentation. But the characters, the Henshaw Coal Company, the families named, and the depot itself are fictional.